The first thing I noticed when I turned onto the dirt road wasn't the noise. It was the light. Not the soft orange glow from a porch lamp. Not a neighbor's driveway light. These were 12 tall metal street lights standing in a straight line across the center of my ranch. Perfectly spaced. Like a suburban road had been dropped into the middle of open pasture. I stopped my truck and stepped out slowly. Fresh trenches cut through the grass where underground cables had been buried. Orange construction flags still marked the route. The poles ran nearly 400 yards across my land, from one neighborhood street to another. A contractor in a reflective vest walked over holding a clipboard. "You the owner?" he asked. I nodded. He glanced back at the lights and shrugged. HOA said this corridor was approved for community street lighting. Approved. On my land. I looked at the nearest pole again. Steel base. County-grade electrical conduit. Utility meter box mounted at the bottom. This wasn't a cheap HOA decoration. This was real infrastructure. Before I could ask anything else, a black SUV rolled up behind the contractor. The woman who stepped out carried herself like she owned the entire project. The HOA president. She walked toward me with a polite, almost rehearsed smile. "Good timing," she said, handing me a folded packet. "Your lighting assessment notice." I opened it. At the top was a number printed in bold. Lighting infrastructure cost share, $48,600. I looked up slowly. "These were installed on my property," I said. Her smile didn't move. "Yes," she replied calmly. "The board approved the corridor last year." Then she added one final line. "And if you refuse to pay, the HOA will place a lien on your ranch." I folded the notice carefully. Because there was only one problem. Street lighting corridors require county easements. And I had never signed one. So the real question wasn't why the HOA built lights on my land. The real question was, how did they build them without the law noticing? If you enjoy realistic justice stories where patience and strategy expose abuse of power, make sure to subscribe to the channel. These stories show how calm thinking, not anger, can dismantle systems that believe no one will challenge them. Because this HOA was about to learn a lesson hidden deep in county law. I bought the ranch 8 years ago. Back then the area looked completely different. There were no neat suburban streets. No rows of identical houses. No HOA signs posted at every entrance. Just open fields, a few scattered barns, and long quiet roads that disappeared into the hills. For me, the place was never meant to be impressive. It was meant to be quiet. After years of military service, quiet places start to matter more than anything else. The ranch gave me that. A small house set back from the road. A wide pasture behind it. Enough land that the night stayed dark and the morning stayed silent. Whenever I returned from training rotations or deployments, this was the first place I came. Fixing fences. Checking water lines. Walking the property lines the way I had done since the day I bought it. Military habits never really disappear. You observe things. You document things. You notice when something changes. And things started changing about 2 years ago. That was when the development began growing on the other side of the county road. At first it was just survey stakes. Then bulldozers arrived. Within months an entire suburban neighborhood started appearing where open land used to be. Eventually the neighborhood formed a homeowners association. An HOA with new roads, decorative entrances, and carefully planted landscaping. Technically, my ranch had nothing to do with that development. The property boundaries had been recorded long before the subdivision existed. The ranch sat just outside the HOA map. But the board seemed to treat the land around them like empty space waiting to be organized. Twice I noticed surveyors standing near my fence line. The first time they said they were checking drainage routes. The second time they mentioned something about future neighborhood improvements. I took pictures both times. Not because I expected trouble. just because documenting things had always been part of how I handled problems. Around that same time, the HOA elected a new president. She had a reputation in the neighborhood. Efficient, confident, extremely focused on raising property values. Under her leadership, the HOA started approving new projects. More landscaping. More street signs. More lighting across the neighborhood streets. Most residents seemed happy about it. But I noticed something else. Every improvement seemed to move the development closer to the ranch boundary. Closer. And closer. Until the day I returned home and saw 12 street lights standing in the middle of my pasture. Because suddenly the HOA hadn't just expanded toward the ranch. They had expanded straight through it. I didn't confront anyone that first morning. Instead, I walked the pasture. The street lights stretched across the land in a perfect line, each one planted deep in freshly disturbed soil. Thick underground conduit connected the poles, running through trenches that had been cut straight across the grass. This wasn't a temporary installation. Someone had brought in heavy equipment. Someone had dug into private property. And someone had done it while I wasn't there. At the base of the nearest pole sat a gray electrical box with a small metal tag attached. Utility identification. Which meant the system had already been connected to the power grid. That made the situation bigger than an HOA landscaping project. This was infrastructure. Real infrastructure. I took pictures of everything. Each pole. Each trench. Each utility connection. Then I drove into the subdivision. The HOA office sat near the neighborhood entrance, a small brick building beside a decorative lake. Inside, the HOA president was exactly as confident as she had been earlier. She didn't seem surprised to see me. In fact, she looked almost relieved. "Good," she said calmly. "I assumed you'd stop by eventually." She pulled a folder from her desk and slid it across the table. Inside were several printed documents. Construction invoices. Lighting diagrams. And one notice printed on official HOA letterhead. At the top of the page was a number in bold black text. Lighting infrastructure assessment, $48,600. I looked up at her. "These lights are on my ranch," I said. "Yes," she replied. Her tone stayed perfectly casual. "The board approved the corridor last year. It connects both sides of the neighborhood." She leaned back slightly in her chair. "You'll receive monthly billing instructions if you prefer to pay in installments." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. Instead, I asked one simple question. Which easement authorized construction on my property? For the first time, she hesitated. But only for a moment. "The HOA vote covers community infrastructure," she said. Then she added the line that told me exactly how confident they felt. "If the balance isn't paid within 30 days, the association will file a lien against your ranch." I folded the notice slowly. Because street lighting systems don't run on HOA votes. They run on county permits. And easements. Neither of which I had ever signed. So before leaving the office, I asked one last question. "Did the county approve this corridor?" Her answer came instantly. "The board handled everything." Which meant only one thing. Someone had installed an entire lighting system on my land. Without ever checking whether they actually had the right to do it. I didn't argue with the HOA president. I didn't threaten lawsuits. I didn't even tell her she was wrong. Instead, I went home and started doing what the military had trained me to do for years. I documented everything. The next morning I walked the entire lighting corridor again. 12 steel poles. Each nearly 20 feet tall. Heavy concrete bases set deep into the ground. Thick underground conduit ran between them. This wasn't cheap decorative lighting. This was the kind of infrastructure normally installed by city contractors. Which made one thing clear. The project had cost serious money. And the HOA believed they had the authority to install it. Back inside the house, I opened the folder the president had given me. Invoices. Construction schedules. Lighting diagrams. At the bottom of the packet was the official HOA notice. Lighting infrastructure assessment, $48,600. Payment due in 30 days. Late fees applied after that. Lien proceedings if unpaid. I set the papers down and opened the county property records website. The ranch parcel map appeared on the screen. The property lines hadn't changed since the day I bought the land. No easement markings. No infrastructure corridors. No recorded utility rights running through the pasture. Which meant one of two things had happened. Either the HOA had obtained an easement I didn't know about, or they had never obtained one at all. There was a simple way to find out. I sent a short email to the HOA office. Just one paragraph. Please provide the following documents regarding the lighting installation across my property. Recorded easement authorization. County electrical permit. Utility corridor approval. I pressed send. An hour later the response arrived. It contained one attachment. The HOA board meeting minutes. Nothing else. No permit. No easement. No county approval. Just a document showing the board had voted to approve the lighting expansion. I read the email twice. Then I drove into town. The county clerk's office sat inside an aging courthouse building that smelled faintly of paper and dust. The clerk behind the counter listened while I explained what I was looking for. She typed the parcel number into her system. Then she frowned slightly. No recorded easements on that property, she said. What about electrical permits? I asked. She searched again. Still nothing. Which meant the lighting system running across my pasture had been installed without any infrastructure permits attached to the land. When I got home, a second HOA notice was already waiting in my mailbox. The balance had changed. Lighting assessment, $48,600. Administrative processing fee, $2,100. New total, $50,700. At the bottom of the notice was a short paragraph. Failure to comply with community infrastructure assessments may result in additional penalties and legal action. 2 days later, a third letter arrived. This time the number had jumped again. Balance due, $56,400. The final line of the notice was printed in bold. The association will initiate lien proceedings if the balance remains unpaid. The HOA clearly believed the pressure would eventually force payment. But the problem was no longer the bill. The problem was the lights themselves. Because if the county records were correct, the entire lighting corridor had been installed without any legal authorization. And there was only one way to confirm that. I filed a formal infrastructure inquiry with the county inspection office. 3 days later my phone rang. The caller introduced himself as a county infrastructure inspector. His first question was simple. Are you the property owner where those new street lights were installed? I said yes. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then he said something that made the entire situation suddenly much bigger. We don't have any permits on file for that installation. Which meant the HOA hadn't just crossed a property line. They may have built an entire electrical system that the county had never approved. 3 days after the county inspector called, another letter arrived from the HOA. This one wasn't just a notice. It was a formal hearing invitation. The board had scheduled a community meeting to discuss noncompliance with neighborhood infrastructure obligations. My name appeared twice in the document. Once as the property owner, and once as the reason the meeting had been called. The tone of the letter made the board's plan obvious. They weren't just trying to collect the lighting assessment anymore. They were preparing to turn the situation into a public example. I showed up anyway. The meeting took place inside the neighborhood clubhouse, a large room filled with folding chairs and a long table where the HOA board sat facing the residents. By the time I arrived, most of the seats were already filled. A projector screen stood behind the board. The HOA president noticed me immediately. She gave a small, polite smile. Not friendly. More like someone greeting a problem they believed was already solved. The meeting started with routine business. Budget updates. Maintenance reports. Then the president cleared her throat and looked toward the audience. There is one final matter we need to address tonight, she said. She clicked a remote, and the projector lit up behind her. A neighborhood development map appeared on the screen. 2 internal roads ran along opposite sides of the subdivision. Between them was a straight corridor marked with small yellow circles. Street lights. And directly in the middle of that corridor was my ranch property. The board recently completed an infrastructure project connecting both sides of the neighborhood lighting system, the president continued. Her tone remained calm and professional. Unfortunately, one nearby property owner is refusing to participate in the assessment required for the project. Several residents turned their heads toward me. Someone whispered. Another homeowner leaned toward the person beside him and said quietly, "That's the ranch guy." The president continued speaking. The lighting corridor increases safety and property value for the entire area. She paused briefly before adding the next sentence. The property owner in question benefits from the same infrastructure but has declined to contribute his share. A few people nodded. Someone near the back muttered, "That doesn't seem fair." The president clicked the remote again. A new slide appeared. At the center was the number printed in bold red. Current balance, $64,200. Failure to resolve this assessment will result in lien enforcement under HOA authority, she said. Then she looked directly at me. Would you like to explain to the community why you believe you are exempt from this obligation? The entire room turned quiet. Dozens of people watching. Waiting. I stood up slowly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. Instead, I asked one simple question. Which permit authorized the electrical installation across my property? The president didn't answer. She simply returned to the agenda. The board has already approved the project, she said firmly. The matter is considered closed. The meeting ended shortly afterward. 2 days later, the HOA followed through on its threat. A certified envelope arrived. Inside was a legal filing notice. Property lien initiated. Balance due. $64,200. The HOA board clearly believed the situation was finished. Public pressure had been applied. Legal pressure had been applied. From the outside, it probably looked like they had already won. But later that same afternoon, my phone rang again. The county inspector was calling back. And this time his voice sounded very different. Something about that lighting project doesn't add up, he said. Then he asked the one question the HOA had been avoiding since the beginning. Did you ever sign an easement for those poles? That night the ranch looked different. The new street lights were already running, casting long white beams across the pasture. The glow stretched over the grass like a road that didn't belong there. From the porch, the lights almost made the land look smaller. Controlled. Organized. Exactly the way the subdivision probably wanted it. I sat on the wooden step and watched the poles for a long time. In the military, you learn something early. Loud problems are rarely the dangerous ones. The real damage usually comes from quiet decisions made by people who believe the system will protect them. The HOA board clearly believed that. They had their paperwork, their meeting minutes, their legal letters. To anyone looking from the outside, they probably appeared organized and legitimate. And now they had a lien filed against the ranch. Most property owners would have reacted the way the board expected. Anger. Arguments. Threats. Those reactions usually make things easier for the other side. But anger had never solved operational problems. Systems did. Processes did. Documentation did. I walked down into the pasture and stopped beside the nearest pole. The steel base hummed faintly with electrical current. Somewhere inside the neighborhood a switch had been flipped and the lights had come on, which meant the system was fully connected. Utilities don't activate equipment without paperwork. At least, they aren't supposed to. I ran my hand along the cold metal of the pole and looked down at the ground where the conduit disappeared into the soil. The county inspector's voice replayed in my head. "Did you ever sign an easement for those poles?" No. I hadn't. Which meant one of two things had happened. Either someone had forged the authorization, or the installation had been connected to the power grid without the proper legal approval. Neither option was small. Both options meant the situation was bigger than an HOA dispute. I walked back toward the house and opened my laptop. There was one document I hadn't asked for yet. Not from the HOA. From the county. A specific record. The infrastructure permit tied to the lighting system. Because if that document didn't exist, the entire row of street lights standing in my pasture might have been installed illegally. And if that turned out to be true, the lien the HOA had just placed on my ranch would be the smallest problem they had. A week passed. Then another letter arrived. This one came from the HOA's attorney. The envelope alone told me the board had decided to escalate. Inside was a formal notice confirming what the previous warning had promised. Lien filed against property. The document listed the amount now attached to the ranch. Lighting infrastructure assessment, $48,600. Administrative fees, $5,800. Legal processing costs, $6,900. Total balance, $61,300. At the bottom of the page was the sentence they wanted me to focus on. Failure to satisfy the balance may result in legal action, including forced sale proceedings under association authority. The message was clear. From the HOA's perspective, the situation was finished. They had installed the lights. They had billed the property owner. And now they had secured the lien that allowed them to enforce payment. For most people, that step would end the argument. Once a lien is attached to land, removing it becomes expensive and complicated. Which was exactly why the HOA had moved quickly. I drove into town that afternoon and stopped by the county clerk's office again. The clerk pulled up the property record on her screen. There it was. The lien filing had already been recorded. From a legal standpoint, the HOA now had a claim against the ranch. Anyone checking the property history would see it. Anyone considering buying the land would see it. To an outside observer, the HOA had just won the fight. Even the neighborhood seemed to think so. Later that evening, one of the homeowners from the subdivision slowed his truck near my fence line. He leaned out the window and gave a sympathetic shrug. HOAs always win those things, he said. Then he drove off. I didn't argue with him. Because on paper, the situation looked exactly the way the board wanted it to look. The lights were standing. The lien was filed. And the balance continued growing. But later that night an email arrived from the county inspector. Attached was a document he had just located in the county records system. The subject line of the message was short. Lighting permit application, rejected. Which meant something important. The HOA had actually submitted paperwork for the lighting corridor. But the county had denied it. And somehow, the street lights had been installed anyway. The county inspector's email arrived just after midnight. Attached to the message was a scanned document pulled directly from the county infrastructure records system. At the top of the page was the title, Utility Lighting Corridor Permit Application. The applicant listed was the neighborhood HOA. The map attached to the permit looked familiar. A straight lighting route connecting two subdivision roads. Right through the center of my ranch pasture. But halfway down the page, stamped in bold red letters, was a single word. Rejected. Below the stamp was a short explanation from the county planning office. Proposed corridor crosses private parcel without recorded easement. In other words, the county had already reviewed the exact plan the HOA later built. and they had denied it. Months earlier, the inspector called me the next morning to confirm what I was seeing. The board submitted that permit last year, he explained. The county rejected it because the route crossed private land without authorization. So they couldn't build it, I said. That's correct, he replied. There was a brief pause before he added the part that mattered most. But the construction date on your photos shows the system was installed after the rejection, which meant the HOA had known the county denied the corridor. And they built it anyway. But the inspector wasn't finished. There's something else, he said. Street lighting connected to the public grid requires a recorded utility easement before power can legally be activated. I thought back to the poles standing in the pasture, the electrical boxes, the hum of power running through the lines. Those lights are already on, I said. The inspector was quiet for a moment. Then he answered slowly. Then someone must have told the utility company they had the legal corridor. That meant one thing. Somewhere in the paperwork used to activate the lighting system, there had to be a document claiming the HOA had the legal right to install it. And if that document existed, the county was about to ask a very serious question. Who signed it? The county inspector asked me to come into the office the following morning. Not to file a complaint. Not to argue with the HOA. Just to look at one document. When I arrived, he was already sitting at a desk with a folder open in front of him. The rejected lighting permit sat on top, but another document rested underneath it. This is what allowed the utility company to connect the system, he said. He slid the page across the desk. At the top was the logo of the regional power utility. Below it was a standard authorization form required before connecting any new electrical infrastructure. Street lights, transformers, power distribution equipment. All of it required the same thing. A signed confirmation that the installer had legal access to the land where the equipment was placed. The inspector tapped a section near the bottom of the page. This is the part that matters. I read the line carefully. Property access authorization, corridor easement verified. Underneath it was a signature. The HOA president. The form stated that the association had the legal authority to install the lighting corridor across the listed parcel. My parcel. The inspector leaned back in his chair. The utility company relies on this certification when they activate infrastructure, he explained. If the signer confirms legal access, the power company doesn't independently verify the property rights. Which meant the system had been activated because the HOA president claimed the corridor had been authorized. Even though the county had already rejected the permit request. Even though no easement had ever been recorded. Even though the land belonged to someone else. The inspector opened another folder. Inside were printed copies of the county's infrastructure statutes. One section was highlighted. Unauthorized utility installation, enforcement clause. He pointed to the highlighted paragraph. If electrical infrastructure is installed without a valid recorded easement, the installation is considered unauthorized. I read the next sentence slowly. Unauthorized infrastructure must be removed at the installer's expense and the property restored to original condition. The inspector folded his hands on the desk. In plain terms, he said, those lights never had legal authorization to be there. For the first time since the situation began, the full scale of the problem became clear. The HOA hadn't just crossed a property boundary. They had installed a public electrical system across land they had no right to use. Then they had certified that access to the power company anyway. Which meant 3 different systems had been bypassed. County infrastructure approval, recorded easement law, and utility authorization verification. The inspector continued. We're opening a formal infrastructure review. What does that mean? I asked. It means the county will determine whether the installation violated state infrastructure statutes. And if it did? He turned the page and pointed to the final section of the law. Mandatory removal order. The words were short and direct. Unauthorized installations must be removed immediately upon enforcement ruling. That meant every pole, every trench, every cable, the entire lighting corridor. All of it would have to come down. And the cost wouldn't be small. The inspector pulled up a cost estimate from the original permit application. The lighting project had cost the HOA nearly $380,000. Removing it would cost even more. And restoring the pasture after trenching would add additional expenses. The inspector closed the folder. The county will schedule a hearing, he said. The HOA board will have an opportunity to explain how the installation happened. I nodded slowly. Do they know about the review yet? He shook his head. Not yet. But word traveled quickly through administrative offices. 2 days later, the HOA president requested an emergency meeting with the county planning department. The same president who had confidently handed me a bill for $48,000. The same president who had filed a lien against my ranch. Now she wanted to explain how a rejected permit somehow turned into a fully operating electrical corridor. But there was one more problem the board hadn't realized yet. The infrastructure statute included another clause. If unauthorized installations caused damage to private land, the responsible party could be required to cover restoration costs and legal fees. Which meant the financial consequences might be far larger than the lighting project itself. The county scheduled the hearing for the following week. And for the first time since the poles appeared in my pasture, the HOA board was about to face a system they didn't control. Because this time the question wasn't about HOA rules, or neighborhood votes, or internal policies. This time the only question that mattered was written directly into the state infrastructure law. Who authorized a utility corridor on land they didn't own? The county hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday morning. It took place inside a small administrative courtroom attached to the county planning department. Nothing about the room looked dramatic. No raised bench like a television courtroom. Just a long table, several chairs, and rows of seats along the back wall for observers. But the consequences being discussed in that room were far larger than the setting suggested. When I arrived, the HOA board was already there. 5 members sat together at one side of the table. The HOA president sat at the center, a thick binder open in front of her. She looked exactly the same as she had the day she handed me the assessment notice, confident, composed, perfectly organized. But the room was different now. This wasn't an HOA meeting. And she wasn't running the agenda. Across the table sat 2 county officials from the planning department and the infrastructure inspector who had called me earlier. Stacks of documents rested between them. When the hearing began, the county planning officer started with a simple statement. This review concerns the installation of an electrical street lighting corridor within parcel 184-27B. That parcel was my ranch. The officer continued. Records indicate the infrastructure was installed without an approved permit and without a recorded easement. The HOA president immediately leaned forward. The lighting project was approved through our association vote, she said. The system benefits the entire neighborhood. The officer nodded calmly. HOA votes do not replace county infrastructure permits. A quiet murmur moved through the room. The officer then projected a document onto a screen at the front. The rejected permit application. The same one the inspector had shown me earlier. The red rejected stamp filled the center of the page. This permit request was denied 11 months ago, the officer explained. The president flipped through her binder. Our understanding was that the corridor could proceed through private agreement, she said. The officer turned to the next document. The utility authorization form. The one that had allowed the power company to activate the lighting system. He pointed to the signature line. This certification states that legal access to the corridor had been verified. The president spoke again, this time slightly more cautiously. The HOA believed the corridor had been approved through board authority. The officer looked directly at her. This document does not reference HOA authority. He tapped the paper. It confirms legal property access. Then he turned toward me. Did you authorize installation of this lighting corridor across your property? No, I said. Did you sign any easement or property access agreement? No. The officer nodded once and wrote something in his notes. Then the infrastructure inspector stood and addressed the room. County records show no easement filed for this parcel, he said. Without a recorded easement, electrical infrastructure cannot legally be installed or connected. He paused. However, the utility company activated the system after receiving the signed authorization form. The implication was obvious. Someone had confirmed legal access that did not exist. The planning officer switched to the final slide. A cost summary from the original lighting proposal. Total project budget: $382,000. The officer spoke slowly. Under state infrastructure law, unauthorized utility installations must be removed if a valid easement cannot be demonstrated. Silence filled the room. The president looked down at her binder, turning pages more quickly now. One of the other board members leaned toward her and whispered something. She stood up again. The lighting system improves safety for hundreds of residents, she said. Removing it would be extremely disruptive. The officer responded without raising his voice. The county cannot authorize infrastructure installed in violation of property and permit laws. He paused before adding the final point. The installation also crosses land belonging to a property owner who never granted permission. The room became very quiet. Every homeowner in the audience understood what that meant. The lighting corridor had been built across land the HOA never controlled. For months the board had acted as if the project was fully legal. They had billed me. They had filed a lien. They had publicly accused me of refusing to contribute to a community improvement. Now the entire project was being examined under county law. The planning officer turned to me once more. Do you have anything you wish to add to the record? I stood slowly. I didn't bring a binder. I didn't bring a speech. I only said one sentence. Utility corridors require easements, not HOA votes. No one spoke after that. The officer nodded once and closed the folder in front of him. The county will issue a formal enforcement decision within 72 hours. The hearing ended. The board members gathered their papers in silence. The president avoided eye contact as she left the room. For months the HOA had treated the situation like an internal dispute they could control. But now the decision belonged to a system far above neighborhood authority. And the numbers involved were no longer $48,000. They were closer to $400,000. Because if the county enforced the infrastructure statute, every single street light standing in my pasture would have to come down. The county's decision arrived 2 days later. It came in the form of a formal enforcement order delivered by certified mail to both the HOA board and the county clerk's office. The document was only 5 pages long. But every line inside it carried weight. At the top of the first page was the ruling from the County Infrastructure Department. Unauthorized utility installation, enforcement order. The report summarized the investigation. The HOA had submitted a lighting corridor permit. The county had rejected it due to the corridor crossing private property without a recorded easement. Despite the rejection, the lighting infrastructure had still been installed months later. 12 poles. Hundreds of feet of underground electrical conduit. A fully activated street lighting system connected to the public power grid. The report then addressed the most important point. No easement had ever been recorded for the land where the installation occurred, which meant the corridor had been constructed without legal authorization. Under state infrastructure statutes, the county had only one option. The enforcement order stated it clearly. Immediate removal of unauthorized electrical infrastructure from Parcel 184-27B. In simple terms, the entire lighting corridor had to be dismantled. The order continued. All removal costs would be the responsibility of the installing party. The installing party was listed as the HOA. The county also required restoration of the affected land. That meant the trenches cut through the pasture had to be filled and repaired. Damaged soil had to be restored. Any fencing or property damage caused during installation had to be corrected. The financial implications were enormous. The original lighting project had cost the HOA more than $380,000. Removing it would require contractors, excavation equipment, and electrical crews. Then the land would have to be repaired afterward. But the order didn't stop there. The next section addressed the lien the HOA had placed against my ranch. The county's legal office had reviewed the filing. Because the infrastructure project itself had been declared unauthorized, the financial assessment attached to it had no legal basis. The lien was therefore considered invalid. The enforcement order required the HOA to file an immediate lien release with the county clerk. By the following afternoon, the lien had been removed from the property record. The number that had once read $64,200 owed simply disappeared from the file. A week later, the first trucks arrived at the ranch. This time, they weren't construction crews installing poles. They were contractors hired to remove them. One by one, the street lights came down. The electrical lines were disconnected. The metal poles were lifted out of the ground and loaded onto flatbed trailers. Excavators filled the trenches where the conduit had been buried. The process took 3 days. By the end of the week, the pasture looked almost the way it had before the HOA project ever began. Only faint lines of disturbed soil remained where the trenches had been. The county inspector stopped by one final time to verify the restoration work. He walked the length of the former lighting corridor, checking measurements and reviewing the repair report. When he finished, he closed his clipboard and looked across the open field. "Everything's been removed," he said. That wasn't the end of the consequences. The enforcement order also triggered an administrative review of the HOA board's actions. Submitting false access certification to a utility company was considered a serious violation. Within a month, 2 members of the board resigned. The HOA president stepped down shortly afterward. The lighting project that was supposed to increase property values had ended up costing the association hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the street lights that once stood across the pasture were gone. Because the one system the HOA believed they could bypass was the one system that ultimately decided the outcome. The law that required a simple easement before installing infrastructure on someone else's land. By the time the last truck left the ranch, the pasture looked quiet again. No tall metal poles. No electrical boxes humming beside the fence. Just open land stretching across the field the way it had for years before the neighborhood ever expanded toward it. The trenches had been filled and leveled. Fresh soil ran in faint lines where the conduit had once been buried, but the grass would grow back soon enough. From the porch, the view at night looked the way it always had. Dark. Clear. Undisturbed. A few weeks after the removal work finished, the county clerk confirmed the property record had been fully corrected. The lien was gone. No financial claim remained attached to the ranch. The HOA had also filed a formal correction letter to residents explaining that the lighting project had been terminated due to infrastructure authorization issues. They never mentioned the rejected permit or the easement that never existed. But most of the neighborhood already understood what had happened. Word travels quickly in places where large projects suddenly disappear. The board eventually elected new leadership. 2 members who had supported the lighting corridor resigned during the investigation. The former president stepped down quietly not long afterward. I never spoke to her again. And there wasn't much reason to. The ranch returned to the same routine it had always followed. Fence repairs. Long walks along the property line. Checking the land after storms. One evening near sunset, I walked out to the spot where the Center Street light had once stood. Only a patch of new grass marked the location now. The land had already started healing. And looking across the quiet field, one thought stayed clear. Systems only fail when people assume no one will check them. The HOA believed their vote gave them authority. But the law that mattered had never changed. You can't build infrastructure on someone else's land. Unless that land actually belongs to you,